Hello there, I'm Lindsay, and today One Cancer Place introduces you to a poignant story of a person, one of a series of personal stories that provides a peek into the authentic life of a cancer patient. We hope that you find the magic in these unique stories because each of these lives is lived to the hilt in service for others and in deep gratitude for survival.
My name is Julie Johnson, and in July of 2019, at age 39, I was diagnosed with undifferentiated pleomorphic sarcoma.
Okay, so I have actually never heard of this. And I think the reason why is because very few people ever get diagnosed with that. How did you come to seek out a diagnosis and what were the events leading up to receiving your diagnosis?
Yeah, so you touched on something that's really common. Most people have not heard of sarcoma. It's a very rare cancer type. It is about 1% of all malignancies. And my specific presentation was a breast sarcoma. So that is a very rare presentation for a sarcoma, as sarcomas are typically found in the extremities, so arms and legs. At the time of my diagnosis, I had a 9-month-old daughter at home and I was breastfeeding. And I noticed a lump in my breast and I thought it was related to nursing. So I wasn't initially concerned. However, after trying many remedies to get the lump to go away on its own, it never did. And that's when I decided to follow up with my physician, who decided that the lump was of a certain size that required more imaging. And so I was sent quickly for a mammogram. It happened to be my first mammogram. So I yet to receive even a baseline mammogram. And after the initial mammogram, I was quickly ushered to a biopsy. And what was interesting in my case is that the biopsy came back as inconclusive, which meant that I had to have a surgery to remove the entire lump so that a pathologist could go through layer by layer, slice by slice to make sure that the diagnosis was correct. After receiving the lumpectomy, a typical pathology takes about 3 to 5 business days. I think mine took a little over 2 weeks before I received a diagnosis. What's even more interesting after that is that I pursued a second opinion, which is always something I recommend to cancer patients that I speak to. And the second opinion was a very well-known cancer institute in the US. And they came back with a different diagnosis, a completely different diagnosis than my original center. And so I think that was really the first indication, to me at least, that my case was going to be very rare. I ended up pursuing 2 additional opinions at other cancer centers. So that brought my total to 4 different opinions at 4 top cancer institutes before I was able to find 2 that agreed on a diagnosis.
Wow. So this is all going on while you have an infant at home that you're also taking care of.
Not only an infant, I have 4 children. So
Oh my goodness.
the 9-month-old was my youngest. At the time, my children were 7, 5, 3, and 9 months when I was diagnosed.
Wow. That is wild. So, you obviously knew, okay, this is not something that normally happens when I'm breastfeeding. So that's what spurred you to even seek this out. And then you went on to get 4 different opinions. Which 2 opinions agreed?
The first opinion and the last opinion.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you finally had what was almost an answer, at least you had an idea of an answer, what were your next thoughts? What were the suggested next steps? And what did you say to your family?
Great questions. So let me talk first about what I said to my family, because I think the next steps of what played out in my cancer experience are also unique and complex. But I think you've touched on something that is and has been very difficult for me, which is, how do you explain a cancer diagnosis like this to your family when your family includes four very young people? And it does add, and even continues to add, a layer of complexity to a situation that's already immensely complex. I do think that communicating to kids about cancer is probably a space that deserves more attention, particularly as we see younger and younger people being diagnosed with cancer. For most families, there's kind of a luxury of easing into these difficult conversations, particularly conversations that involve illness and death. But when you have a cancer diagnosis and you have young children, that luxury is stripped away. And you have to not only figure out quickly how to come to terms with it yourself, but you also have to help others process it. And right or wrong, and there's no right or wrong in these situations, my husband and I decided to be as age appropriately open with our kids as we knew how to be. We used books or talk tracks from other patients or physicians to help us find the language to have these conversations with young children.
What were some of the books that you found most helpful? Because I know that talking to young people is not easy when they're going to ask tough questions.
Yeah, and I think this is where it also gets really interesting, because cancer is so unique. And so the way you talk about one person's cancer is very unique. And while we used books, that was one of the things I found, is that I didn't really find a book that I felt communicated it in the way that fit my situation. And so I do remember receiving some books from a wonderful organization who sends books to parents who have kids, that are either going through cancer, or the parents are going through cancer. And these books are designed to at least help parents start to have these conversations. And I remember my husband and I joking about the fact that I would go through these books and cross out words and, replace certain words with other words that I was more comfortable with, just because I felt like, these are really big topics, and I really wanted to find kind of my language and our language. And I really wanted to give my kids a chance to ask questions or have a certain voice on certain things, or I really just wanted to meet them where they were, but not push them into places that they weren't ready to go.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, what I'm mostly getting from you is that at every point, you like to sort of steer the ship with
Yeah.
what your journey with cancer needed to be, right? For you and for the people in your life. And it seems like that was just the way that you went about it. Was there something that spurred you to be so hands on with your own way of moving through this whole process of deciding how to speak to your family and even deciding how to seek treatment and who to seek it from?
I think that when you have a cancer diagnosis, and especially for me, with the early stages of my diagnosis being more complex and being uncertain, I quickly came to the realization that there are no right answers and there are no wrong answers. And that at some point you have to trust your intuition. And that when there are no right or wrong answers, you have freedom to do what feels best for you and for the people in your family or your support system. And so it still is looking at a situation, kind of balancing pros and cons, and just making a few forward steps to determine if this still feels right. And if it doesn't, you can always reorient. But I think the most important thing is not to get stuck in a place where you're spinning with all of the options and it prevents you from forward progress.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like you said, there's so many options and there's so many things that you can choose to do and lanes you can choose to take. So, talk to me more about what you eventually decided to do, which, as with everything we've spoken about before, is a little bit unconventional. Yeah.
Yeah.
How did you choose to move forward after your diagnosis?
Sure. So after we received consensus on my diagnosis, I chose a local cancer center where I felt very comfortable with the physicians that would be treating me and with their plan. I moved forward with 6 weeks of radiation. Well, first I had surgery to actually, I had a mastectomy to remove my left breast. And then I had radiation to the chest wall, so to the area that was left after the mastectomy. And 3 weeks into my 6 week course of radiation, my team discovered a new tumor that was growing in my chest wall. So this tumor was right in the middle of the radiation field, meaning my tumor was growing despite these powerful, tactics that we were using to direct to the area. This also is very rare. So put another check in the "this is rare" box. Thankfully, I was able to have that new tumor removed, but it meant that my disease was more aggressive than we originally thought. And at that point, after having the chest wall tumor removed, my physicians recommended 5 rounds of very intense chemotherapy. And I went through those 5 rounds of chemotherapy. And the last few rounds of chemotherapy just happened to be at the height of the pandemic, which made the entire experience more difficult than anticipated because our support system that we had come to heavily rely on went into lockdown. And it was 5 months after I ended chemotherapy that a scan picked up a single lung nodule in my left lung. And so that placed me in the camp of metastatic sarcoma. Thankfully, again, I was able to find a surgeon who was very willing to remove that lung tumor, although it was a very painful surgery. And at that point, after having that nodule removed, I remember going back to my oncologist, raring to go, basically, like, what next? And he looked at me and he said, I don't have a target to watch anymore. So your only option is just to watch and wait for the cancer to return. And he said, unfortunately, given the aggressiveness of your disease and given the frequency at which your disease is recurring, the odds of a recurrence are almost certain. And he placed them somewhere between 80 and 90%. And essentially set me on my way and said, we will look again in a few months and see if you have disease progression. And if you do, we will treat it accordingly. And
They really didn't give you any option of how to preempt this almost certain reoccurrence.
no. And
Wow.
I've come to find that that is very common. And there are reasons for a watch and wait approach, even in a case like mine, where the chances of recurrence are very high. When you start giving treatments to patients, you do want to know if the treatment is working or not. And the best way to know if a treatment is working or not is to have a target to watch. So a tumor. And when you can watch a tumor either grow or shrink in response to treatment, then you've got a pretty good understanding as to whether or not the treatment is working. And so for me, I was in a situation where I didn't have any visible evidence of disease on a scan. And so my oncologist felt that it was not prudent to be giving treatment in an environment where we have no idea if it's working or not. Now, I am not the type of patient who was comfortable with watch and wait, given the recurrence likelihood that I was quoted. So I tried to get as creative and kind of curious with the way that I approached health. I began networking with physicians, standard physicians, integrative physicians. I tried to talk to as many long-term survivors as I could find. I would find them on Facebook groups, on Twitter, on other social media platforms. I was scouring books. I learned to read medical journals, and I started investigating various therapies that might be applicable to me. One day, at the advice of a peer, another patient, was told about a webinar that was taking place regarding clinical trials and cancer vaccines. And I attended the webinar, and the physician that was speaking was running a clinical trial on personalized cancer vaccines. And as he spoke, I had already known about cancer vaccines, but I did not know how to actually acquire a cancer vaccine. And so as he spoke about one of his beliefs being that cancer vaccines are best used in patients that have a low tumor burden. So not, a person who doesn't have very many tumors, or ideally no tumors, but has a very high chance of relapse. And I immediately knew that was me and that I wanted to do anything and everything I could to be in that trial. So before the webinar was even over, I was on the phone with University of California in San Diego, trying to figure out how to get an appointment with this physician so that I could see if I could get in the trial. After many different appointments and many different conversations, I came to find out that there was one spot left in the arm of the trial that was best suited for me, which was candidates or patients that had no evidence of disease, but had a very high likelihood of relapse. And so I was able to secure the last spot on that arm of the trial. And for the past 10 months almost, I have been flying to San Diego once or twice a month, some months more than that, to participate in this clinical trial. And so that is really where I am now. I have been disease-free, or I don't want to say disease-free. I have been without evidence of disease for now 2 years. And I think that the curiosity and the intentionality in which I've approached my disease and luck, I think is very lucky that I was able to, that the timing worked out, that I was able to be a part of this trial. I think all of those things combined have helped get me to where I am today.
Yeah. And some of the things that you have mentioned about being the most important factors in your personal journey are that you are a very curious person naturally, and that you have kind of the support around you to be able to participate in things like this trial and flying to California to participate in things like that. Can you talk a little bit more about the ways in which your personal network and you have taking the reins to keep yourself mentally fit for this challenge? Can you talk a little bit about the ways in that has helped you?
Sure. I do think that the biggest challenge I have faced in this entire experience is the mental aspect of cancer. It has been very difficult for me to figure out how to get my mind in a place where I'm not obsessing over my next scan or obsessing over the fact that I've been told that my cancer is very likely to return. And if it does, there's a chance that it could really cut my life much shorter than I ever imagined. These have all been very difficult topics that I've had to navigate. And for me, there's really not been a part of my life that hasn't been changed by cancer. And I think emotionally and mentally, those are two areas where I feel like I've seen a significant amount of change. I mean, especially when I received my metastatic diagnosis, I feel like that was a very low point for me mentally. It was very difficult for me to wrap my head around how I went from a flourishing, healthy 39-year-old to all of a sudden being told that I have metastatic cancer and my life could be cut very short and I would never, your mind goes to places like you'll never know your children and they will never know you. And so you immediately go to these very dark places. And it took some time for me to realize that I was visiting and living in that space more than I needed to. And there are no playbooks for how to deal with the mental side of cancer, but in talking with patients and survivors and those in the cancer field, it's increasingly clear that this is a side of cancer that we need to take seriously and that there's real benefit in addressing. And part of my approach to all of my challenges has been really to approach the challenges with curiosity and experimentation. And so when it came to the mental side of cancer, I asked myself, like, what is the biggest barrier that I'm facing right now? And what would it take to knock down that barrier? And these are actually hard conversations that you have to have with yourself. And sometimes it's easy to kind of wallow in things like, I don't have a way to get rid of the fact that I have a metastatic tumor in my lung, or that, I have to have a lung surgery, or that I'm feeling anxious and depressed. But, if you kind of break that problem into smaller pieces, it does become interesting to see what you can come up with. And so for me, I started experimenting with any technique that I could find that could help me right my mind and get my mind to a place where it was a bigger asset for me. So again, that might be things like reading books or talking to people who have faced similar situations. I think in the case of mental health, I started experimenting with counseling, and my counselor taught me some very interesting and useful techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy. He taught me how to reframe problems. I even ventured off into some places that some people might find questionable, like something called the emotional freedom technique or tapping or even hypnosis. I embrace this idea of curiosity. And, when there's not a rule book or there's not a playbook or there's not a framework on how to solve something, then for me, the only thing I know how to do is just try. And I tried never to prejudge any of these things that I was trying, no matter how outlandish they might seem.
Yeah.
And I felt like I would let my experience guide me. And some of these things that many people consider fringe or outlandish, in many cases, happen to be very helpful for me.
Yeah. Well, you said that another thing that helped you, which was not so outlandish, is speaking to people who had that experience. Just seeking out other people who have been living with cancer or had family members. And One Cancer Place is a place to do that. Can you tell me how you found One Cancer Place and the types of things that you participate in through that organization?
Sure. So you are correct in that one of my biggest strategies and one of the ways that I spend a lot of my time, even today, is networking. And I try to connect with current patients, long term survivors, leaders of nonprofits. And I met Erica, who's the founder of One Cancer Place, on LinkedIn during one of my searches, many searches, for people who I thought might think about cancer differently. And so Erica and I had a conversation one Saturday afternoon, and we clicked immediately as we share very similar philosophies on the importance of being a curious and engaged, kind of courageous patient who's willing to take that road less traveled. And, you know, for me, One Cancer Place, has supported me in countless ways as a patient. But one of the biggest ways that I've found benefit from One Cancer Place is that they've connected me to an entire community of patients like me. I don't mean what I'm going to say next. I don't mean to say it in a disparaging way to any of the other communities, but I wasn't looking for what I'm going to call a kiss and cry community. I wasn't looking for general educational resources because I felt like I had exhausted those already. I wasn't looking for, people to tell me about therapies that were 10, 20 years away. What I was looking for was a group of people who were empowered to learn and who had the courage to think strategically and differently about their case, and who were approaching their care in radically different ways if their diagnosis necessitated it. And at One Cancer Place, patients like that, that's where they're created, they're celebrated, and then those types of patients are turned loose to inspire and influence others.
I love that. And it seems like being able to speak about, all of the things that you mentioned, being curious, being afraid, being confused about how to talk to your family about it. And if you haven't gone through it, you might not really be able to talk to someone else about it or to be a safe listening space for someone else who needs to talk about it. So, I guess in our last little bit of time here, what would you say to someone who is looking for a community and who maybe is just now coming across One Cancer Place and they might be living with cancer themselves or they might be supporting a loved one? What advice would you give to them?
I think my advice that I would give to patients, again, is to be curious and to network. I think, I feel like networking with people who are a few steps ahead of me, cancer experience wise, or even life experience wise with cancer, have been some of the easiest and most meaningful ways to jumpstart my knowledge in a particular area. So, I would recommend to people that they find patients like they aspire to be. And for some patients don't aspire to be a patient like me. There are some patients who I talk to and tell me I would never spend the amount of time or my personal resources or they just don't have a desire to engage in the way that I have. And there is nothing wrong with that. I think that's one of the things that is really important for a patient to decide is, what kind of patient do you want to be? And again, in something like cancer, there's no right or wrong answer. for me, I knew that I wanted to be a curious, empowered patient because I felt like that would give me the best chance at surviving a very rare cancer where there aren't deep treatment options and there aren't a lot of new promising options on the horizon. And so for someone in my situation, networking with people is a way for me to find hidden gems of the cancer world. And that might mean finding innovative physicians who, are willing to who have a different risk profile than other physicians, or finding organizations that help overcome a pain point that a certain patient might experience. So, if you're a new patient and you're only going to do one thing, I would say the number one thing you can do is start talking with other patients.
Yeah, I love that. Well, Julie, we are at the end of the time, but one thing that I want you to maybe close out is I thought it was really beautiful what you wrote about how having cancer didn't just change your outlook on your health, it changed every single part of your life. If you could say that a little bit and a little bit about maybe the directions that cancer has allowed you to grow in, that I think that would be really interesting and I would love for that to be included here.
Sure. So, I think when someone is diagnosed with cancer, there's a fundamental change that can happen as a result of the experience. And again, I don't want to say that this is true about everyone who has a cancer diagnosis, but certainly for me, this diagnosis has really changed the entire fabric of my being in a way that is very difficult to even put into words. I feel like I am a very different person now than I was pre-cancer. So it's impacted me mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, professionally, and relationally. And if we had time, I could dig into exactly how it has impacted me in all of those different ways. But essentially, there's not a segment of my life that remains unaltered as a result of this diagnosis. And I say it often, cancer is a thief, and it is. It has robbed me of many things, whether that's money or the vision for how I thought my future would play out, my career aspirations, even friendships. But what it has left behind really is immense gratitude for each day, gratitude for my remaining health, and an intentionality around how I want to spend my time and how I want to live my life. And it has left me with a very crystal clear perspective on the things that matter most, like family, faith, friendship, health. And so while I don't wish cancer on anyone, I often wonder what people and the greater world would be like, if we all had an experience that allowed us to fully grasp how fragile life is and the finiteness of our mortality, the way those of us living with cancer have to do on a daily basis.
One Cancer Place, the newest patient-led community, leads the way in delivering the revolution in cancer care to its growing membership of cancer stakeholders and patients. Find and connect with us at www.onecancerplace.org.